Dorothea Calloway stood in the doorway of the house she built and watched herself become a stranger to it. Two suitcases sat behind her on the porch she had sanded by hand 27 years ago. The kitchen she designed still carried the scent of rosemary from the garden she had saved. The floors still held the stain she had applied on her knees at 2 in the morning, because it needed one more coat before the sun came through. And Garrett stood 6 feet away in the hallway, adjusting his watch, wearing the patient expression of a man who believed signatures made him innocent. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The papers had already done the work. If you have ever watched someone walk away from the life they built with nothing but what the court allowed them to carry, then you already know this story is not about a house. It is about what happens when a woman's labor disappears, one document at a time. Stay with Dorothea. Subscribe now. Because what her grandmother hid in a cabin on the Blue Ridge is the kind of truth too many women never get to prove. To understand why that truth shattered Dorothea, we have to go back 30 years. Before the courtroom, before the settlement, before the empty drawer beside the stove. Back to the first afternoon she saw Larkspur Lane, when the house was nothing but a ruin, and Dorothea was nothing but a woman who could see what no one else bothered to look for. It was a Thursday in a late October. Rain moved through the Shenandoah Valley in soft gray curtains blurring the mountains behind the trees. Garrett kept both hands on the steering wheel of their borrowed sedan and stared through the windshield at the house at the end of the gravel drive. The porch leaned. White paint curled from the siding like dead skin. A gutter hung loose on the east side, swinging with each gust. The yard was more weed than grass, and the flower beds had surrendered years ago to whatever grew fastest. Garrett did not turn off the engine. Dorothea, this is not a house. This is an insurance claim with a mailbox. But Dorothea had already stopped hearing the rain. She was looking at the oak tree in the side yard. Thick trunk, low branches, the kind of tree that held a rope swing in summer and dropped copper leaves in October, like it was paying the earth back for something. She was looking at the wide front porch, at the tall windows on the second floor, at the kitchen facing south, where the afternoon light would enter without being asked. She was looking at a small room above the stairs, a room where she could put a work table, fabric swatches, paint cards, and the quiet parts of herself she had not yet learned how to protect. The realtor stood under the porch overhang with a folder over her head. She was young. She had been standing there long enough for her shoes to darken from the wet. "It needs a lot of work," she said as Dorothea climbed the steps. Dorothea touched the brass doorknob. The metal was cold and green with age. That is not always a bad thing. Inside the house showed itself the way old houses do, not with charm but with evidence. Water stains on the ceiling, warped trim around the door frames, a kitchen where one cabinet door hung crooked, and the floor had gone dull from decades of boots and silence. Garrett saw damage. Dorothea saw height. Garrett saw money leaving his wallet. Dorothea saw craftsmanship beneath the neglect, bones that had held for over a century, walls that had simply been waiting for someone to care again. Then she stepped into the kitchen. The light came through the south-facing windows, like it had been doing this for 100 years, and intended to keep going whether anyone noticed or not. Dust moved through it slowly. The counters were bare. The sink was stained. But the room had a stillness to it that was not emptiness. It was patience. Dorothea stood at the center of that room and did not move. Some places do not impress you. They recognize you. And that kitchen with its cracked tile and cloudy glass and the faintest smell of pine sap still buried in the walls recognized Dorothea before she had said a word. That night, Garrett sat at the small table in their rented duplex near Waynesboro and spread the numbers out like a verdict. Inspection estimates, repair costs, loan terms, the down payment gap they could not close no matter how many times he rearranged the columns. The numbers do not make sense. Thea. He always called her Thea when he was trying to sound gentle and final at the same time. Dorothea waited until he went to bed. Then she carried the inspection report to the kitchen phone and called Grandma Lenora. It was past 10. The line rang 4 times. Lenora picked up the way she always did mid-breath, like the phone had interrupted a thought she had been chasing since morning. Dorothea read everything: the roof estimate, the plumbing, the electrical panel that needed replacing, the termite damage along the east wall, the gap between what they had and what the house required. Lenora listened without a single interruption. No gasp, no hesitation. When Dorothea finished, the line went quiet long enough for the furnace in the duplex to click on and off. Then Lenora asked one question. Did it feel like yours? Dorothea closed her eyes. The kitchen light came back. The oak, the upstairs room, the way the floor creaked beneath the south-facing windows like the house was breathing. Yes, then come by tomorrow. The next afternoon, Dorothea drove 40 minutes into the hills past Staunton to Lenora's farmhouse. The place smelled the way it always smelled. Peppermint tea, old paper lavender tucked into drawers that had not been opened in years. Lenora was sitting near the window with a blanket across her knees thinner than last winter, but still watching the road like she expected the world to try something. She handed Dorothea an envelope without ceremony. Inside was a cashier's check. Dorothea looked at the number. Then she looked at her grandmother. Grandma, I cannot take this. You can, and you will. I do not know when I could pay it back. It is not a loan. The words landed heavier than the check. Dorothea tried to speak. Lenora did not let her. This is a gift to you, not to Garrett, not to the marriage, to you. Do you understand the difference? Dorothea almost smiled. She thought Lenora was being careful the way old women sometimes are protective of money they spend decades saving. But Lenora was not smiling. Her eyes were clear and steady in a way that made polite objections feel like lies. She reached across the table and placed her hand over Dorothea's. Keep records of what you give, baby. Every receipt, every check, every hour you put into that house with your own hands. Love may be honest. Paperwork is not always kind. Then she slid a folded note across the table. On the outside, in blue ink in handwriting that had not wavered in 60 years, she had written 7 words. For the house that already knows your name. Dorothea kept that note in the second drawer beside the stove after they bought Larkspur Lane. The same drawer she would open 27 years later to find completely empty. Not messy, not rearranged, empty. As if someone had reached inside and removed the one thing that proved Dorothea had ever been given anything at all. But that comes later. In those first years, Garrett did not steal Dorothea's work. He praised it. That was how it began. He stood in the kitchen while she held paint cards against the morning light and told her she had a rare eye. He watched her strip wallpaper until her shoulders ached, then stand back and tilt her head at the bare plaster, like she was listening to it decide what color it wanted to be. He watched dinner guests pause at the front door, look around the room, and ask what made the house feel so alive. In those early years, Dorothea still answered, I chose the color after watching how the light changed between 9 and noon. I found that sconce at an estate sale in Lexington. I moved the hydrangeas because the afternoon heat was scorching them against the stone. Small answers, true answers. Then Garrett learned to arrive before she finished. We worked hard on it. Or I told Thea we needed something warmer in here. Or that was part of the overall vision. The first time Dorothea barely noticed. The second time she noticed and forgave it. The third time she noticed and stayed quiet. That was the order of things in their marriage. Notice, forgive, silence, repeat. One evening in the 6th year, Garrett invited 2 real estate clients to dinner at Larkspur Lane. He was building a reputation in the Shenandoah market. Charm was his currency. Dorothea was his proof. She spent the entire day preparing, polished the floors, set the table with linen she had pressed that morning, clipped rosemary from the garden, and placed it in a small jar beside the candles. She positioned those candles where the dining room shadows fell too sharply, because she had learned years ago that the right light could make a room feel like a conversation instead of a performance. During dessert, one client leaned back in his chair, and looked around the room the way people look at something they want to own. Garrett, this house is exactly the kind of feeling you should be creating in your listings. Garrett smiled. He set down his wine glass. He looked at the room like he was seeing it for the first time, even though he had walked through it every day for 6 years without changing a single thing. That is what I have been trying to teach my team. Dorothea's hand stopped on the coffee pot. Not long enough for anyone to see, but long enough for something inside her to shift the way a foundation shifts when the soil beneath it begins to move. Not a crack, not yet. Just the first quiet separation between what holds and what is about to give. He had not simply accepted a compliment. He had taken the room she made and turned it into evidence of his talent. And the two clients nodded, and Garrett poured more wine, and Dorothea carried the coffee pot back to the kitchen and stood alone beside the stove and said nothing. That was the night the table in the kitchen stopped being just a table. It became the surface where Garrett's success was assembled from Dorothea's hands. The next week, he brought home photographs of a listing near Wintergreen. A large property, cold staging, empty rooms that looked expensive and unloved. Just help me warm it up, the way you do. Dorothea worked at the kitchen table until almost midnight. She rearranged the layout, softened the colors, changed the copy so buyers could imagine children in the hallway and coffee in the morning, and the smell of bread on a Sunday afternoon. She turned a brochure into a feeling. Garrett presented it Monday morning. By Friday, he had the client. By Saturday, he had the praise. By the following month, he had a new line on his company website. Creative Property Positioning by Garrett Calloway. Dorothea stared at those words on the screen. Her work was there. Her name was not. Garrett came up behind her and kissed the top of her head. Looks professional, does not it? She wanted to say that was mine. She wanted to say you are standing on my name. Instead, she said it looks good. That sentence became a door she closed on herself. And once it closed, she could not remember how to open it again. More work followed. Listing packets, design boards, client presentations, open house layouts, handwritten thank you notes in Garrett's voice, only warmer, only kinder. Because Dorothea understood something about houses and the people who wanted them that Garrett never would. She understood that buying a home was not a transaction. It was an act of faith. And she wrote to that faith every time, even though the signature at the bottom was never hers. She told herself it was partnership. But partnership should leave fingerprints on both sides. This only ever left his. Grandma Lenora noticed during a visit in late May. The kitchen table was covered with Garrett's client materials. Dorothea was trimming photographs and arranging fabric samples into neat rows for a listing in Harrisonburg. Her hands moved quickly. Her posture was bent. Lenora stood in the doorway for a long time before she spoke. She did not look at the materials first. She looked at Dorothea, at the way her granddaughter sat in her own kitchen like a woman working in someone else's office. Is your name on any of this? Dorothea kept her eyes on the scissors. It is for his business. That was not my question. Before Dorothea could answer, Garrett walked through the back door phone against his ear mid-sentence in a conversation about closing costs. He kissed Dorothea's cheek without looking at the table. Then he noticed Lenora and smiled the way he smiled at everyone, bright, warm, and perfectly measured, keeping her busy. She likes having something useful to do. Useful. The word landed softly, like a leaf falling on a wound. Lenora did not argue with him. She never argued with men like Garrett. She had learned decades ago that arguing with a man who controls the room is like shouting at weather. It changes nothing. It exhausts you, and it gives him evidence that you are the unreasonable one. So she watched him leave, still talking, still carrying his importance around like a briefcase that never got lighter. After his car pulled out of the drive, Lenora reached into her purse. This time there was no speech, no check, no financial instruction. She placed a single object in Dorothea's hand and folded her granddaughter's fingers over it. An iron key, dark with age, tied with a short length of blue thread. There is a cabin past Burnsville. up toward the Blue Ridge off the gravel past the old white church. My name is the only name on it. Garrett will never think to search for it. Dorothea looked down at the key. It was heavier than it should have been. Grandma, why are you giving me this? Lenora's face softened. Not with sadness, with something older than sadness. Something that had already grieved and come out the other side carrying a shovel. Because a woman should have one door in this world that no one else controls. Dorothea wanted to laugh. She wanted to say Garrett would never do anything cruel enough to make a hidden cabin necessary. But the client packet on the kitchen table had no trace of her name. And the listing on the website carried his signature over her sentences. And the word useful was still hanging in the air like smoke from a fire no one had admitted was burning. For the first time, the key in her palm did not feel dramatic. It felt like the only honest thing in the room. She closed her fingers around it. The iron pressed cold against her skin. Behind her, the kitchen table sat covered with Garrett's papers, arranged in perfect little stacks by the woman whose name appeared on none of them. And somewhere in the mountains above Burnsville, past a gravel road, Garrett had never seen a cabin weighted in the trees with a loose floorboard and a locked tin box and a truth that Dorothea did not yet know she would one day need more than the house she was standing in. But Grandma Lenora knew. She had always known. Because Lenora had not simply handed Dorothea a key. She had handed her granddaughter the first piece of a map that led to proof Garrett could never explain away. And the second piece was already hidden beneath a kitchen table in the mountains, inside a blue folder, inside a tin box, inside a silence that had been waiting 20 years to finally speak. The first paper Garrett asked Dorothea to sign looked harmless. That was what made it easy. It came on a Tuesday evening in late October, almost exactly 7 years after they bought Larkspur Lane. Rain tapped against the kitchen windows. The house smelled of roasted chicken and lemon soap. Dorothea had just finished drying the last plate when Garrett walked in carrying a folder under one arm, the way a man carries a newspaper he has already read. Refinancing papers, nothing serious, better rate, cleaner structure. Dorothea dried her hands on the dish towel. She sat at the kitchen table. Garrett opened the folder and turned pages, for her pointing where her pen should go. Here, initial here, date here. Her pen moved, then it stopped. One line mentioned title structure, a phrase she did not recognize. She read it again. Something about primary borrower designation, something about lien position. What does this mean? Garrett leaned closer. His aftershave arrived before his explanation. That is just lender language. The house stays with us. This just keeps things clean on their end. Clean. Dorothea would hear that word so many times over the next 2 decades that it would eventually stop sounding like a word and start sounding like a lock turning. For one quiet second, Lenora's voice came back. Paperwork is not always kind. She almost asked more. Then Garrett gave a small sigh. Not angry. Worse. Disappointed. The kind of sigh that makes a woman feel she's being difficult for reading a document she's being asked to sign with her own legal name. So Dorothea signed. Dorothea Calloway. Her pen moved across the line the way water moves over a stone. Smoothly, quickly wearing something away so slowly that neither of them could see it happening. Garrett gathered the papers before the ink had fully dried. He kissed her forehead. Thank you. This helps more than you know. She watched him leave the kitchen with the folder, and for reasons she could not explain, the south-facing light through the window seemed thinner than it had that morning. After that night, more papers appeared. Business forms, insurance updates. A home equity adjustment, Garrett said, should have been corrected years ago. Each document arrived with the same calm voice, the same brief explanation, the same quiet pressure to trust the man who understood the numbers. Dorothea signed them all, not because she was foolish, because she was married. And marriage for 30 years had taught her that questioning Garrett's paperwork felt the same as questioning Garrett's love. He had designed it that way, not all at once, one folder at a time. During those years, Dorothea continued doing the work that made Larkspur Lane valuable. She rebuilt the garden wall after a winter storm cracked the old mortar. She replaced the upstairs bathroom tile herself, spending 3 weekends on her knees with a level and a bucket of thinset. She repainted the porch every 2 years, because the Virginia humidity ate paint the way time eats promises. None of it appeared on any document. Garrett's business grew. He opened a second office in Charlottesville. His website expanded. His face appeared on bus stop benches and supermarket carts across the valley. Creative property positioning by Garrett Calloway. And behind that sentence, invisible as the nails holding the porch boards in place, Dorothea's work kept the whole thing standing. Margot was born in this fourth year at Larkspur Lane. She grew up in rooms Dorothea had shaped. She learned to walk on floors Dorothea had refinished. She pressed her small hands into the garden soil Dorothea had turned and composted and protected from deer every autumn. But Margot grew up hearing Garrett's version of things, not because he told lies, because he told incomplete truths with complete confidence, and a child cannot always hear what is missing from a sentence that sounds whole. "Dad built this house," Margot said once when she was 9, showing a school friend her bedroom. Dorothea was passing in the hallway. She stopped. Garrett was downstairs on the phone. He could not have heard. But the sentence landed in Dorothea's chest and stayed there not as anger, but as something slower and heavier. A question she did not yet know how to ask. "When did I disappear from my own home?" She knelt and smiled at Margot's friend. "We both worked on it, sweetheart." Margot glanced at her, the way children glance at corrections that do not match the story they have already learned. Then she turned back to showing her friend the closet. Years folded into each other. Dorothea stopped counting the listing packets. She stopped noticing when Garrett used her language in his presentations. She stopped reaching for credit the way a person stops reaching for a light switch in a room that has been dark long enough to navigate by memory. Then 3 months before Lenora died, Dorothea drove to Staunton. The farmhouse was quieter than before. The peppermint tea was weaker. The blanket on Lenora's knees was heavier because the body beneath it had lost the weight that once made winter a small inconvenience. Lenora sat near the same window, thinner, slower, but still watching the world like a woman who had been right about too many things to start being surprised now. Dorothea tried to talk about ordinary things, a new perennial she had planted beside the porch, Margot's school play, a listing Garrett was particularly proud of. Lenora let her talk. Then, when the room had settled into the kind of quiet that only old houses and old women know how to hold, she asked the question Dorothea had been hoping no one would. "Has he put anything in front of you lately?" Dorothea went still. Her hands found each other in her lap. "A few things. For the house, for his business. Nothing unusual." Lenora reached beside her chair and opened a small wooden box. Inside were stamps, old receipts, rubber bands, and one folded envelope tied with blue thread. The same blue thread as the cabin key. She placed it in Dorothea's hand. "The cabin key is still yours, but a key may not be enough." Dorothea frowned. She turned the envelope over. It was light, almost empty. "If the papers ever start telling a story you do not recognize, go to the cabin." "Grandma, you are scaring me." "No, I am trying to leave you less scared later." Lenora's hand closed over hers. The skin was paper thin, but the grip was not. "Under the kitchen table. Third board from the left. It is loose. Leave it loose." "What is under it?" "Something Garrett cannot explain away." 3 months later, Lenora was gone. Dorothea stood at the graveside in a black coat and held Margot's hand and watched the dirt cover the only woman who had ever told her to keep receipts for love. The envelope went into Dorothea's cedar chest unopened. She told herself Lenora had been overcautious. She told herself the warning belonged to some faraway future that might never arrive. But Garrett had already been building that future one signature at a time. And the kitchen table where Dorothea had signed every one of those documents sat in the same room where the light still came through the south-facing windows each morning, steady and unchanged. The only thing in that house that never pretended to be something it was not. The divorce papers arrived on a Monday morning in April. Dorothea was outside pruning the hydrangeas. Her gloves were damp, her knees ached. There was dirt under her fingernails from repotting the rosemary that had outgrown its container over winter. Garrett was inside on a call, laughing in the voice he used when Money was listening. The mail carrier handed Dorothea the certified envelope and looked away too quickly. That was the first sign. Some news arrives before you open it. She carried the envelope to the kitchen, placed it on the table. The same table. Always the same table. Garrett came in 15 minutes later. He saw the envelope. Then he saw her face. For 1 second, the man behind the manners showed. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved to the envelope the way eyes move to a wound they already know the shape of. Then the manners returned. I wanted to talk to you before that came. Dorothea looked at him. No. You wanted it to arrive before I could ask questions. Garrett did not answer. His silence filled the kitchen the way silence fills a room when someone has been caught standing exactly where they planned to be. In the weeks that followed, Dorothea learned how fast a marriage becomes paperwork. The house became an asset. 30 years became account names, payment records, date signatures, and legal phrases that sounded neutral until they were used against her. Her attorney, Judith Pemberton, worked from a narrow office on a side street near downtown Staunton. The shelves were full but organized. The desk was old oak. Judith was calm and careful and honest in a way that did not make the truth softer, but made it possible to hear without flinching. One afternoon, Judith spread Garrett's documents across her desk. Her eyes moved from page to page. Then her hand stopped. Dorothea. Some of these signatures gave him more control than you realized. Dorothea sat very still. The house, Judith nodded slowly. The refinancing restructured the title in ways that favored his position. The equity adjustment moved more of the documented value under his name. His attorney is going to argue that his income carried the home financially. Dorothea's mouth went dry. I carried that house. I know. No, I mean I carried it. I stripped walls, I sanded doors, I paid for materials with my own savings. I helped his business grow so he could keep paying for everything. Judith's voice lowered. I believe you. Then she looked at the file again, and Dorothea understood. Belief was not evidence. In this room, belief was a woman's word. Evidence was a man's signature on a form he had designed. The hearing took place on a gray morning in Augusta County. Garrett wore a navy suit. Dorothea wore a black dress she had bought for funerals. Patricia Voss spoke first. Garrett's attorney was a woman which Dorothea had not expected. She was precise, unhurried, and thorough in the way a surgeon is thorough. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She had the paperwork, primary income, documented payments, refinance structure, reasonable settlement. Each phrase sounded clean. Each one moved the house further from Dorothea. Judith spoke about labor, about the renovations, about the design work and the listing copy and the business growth that Dorothea had quietly powered for 2 decades. She spoke well, she spoke clearly, but the room kept returning to paper. Who signed? Who paid? Who appeared on the record? Dorothea wanted to stand up and tell them about the porch, about the kitchen light, about the oak tree she had fed and pruned for 27 years, about the winter night she slept in the dining room because the floor stain needed one more coat before morning, about the garden wall she rebuilt after the February ice storm while Garrett was at a conference in Richmond. But none of that had a line on a legal form, and Patricia Voss never once looked at Dorothea the way one woman looks at another when she understands what is being lost. She looked at her the way an accountant looks at a column that does not add up. When the terms came, Dorothea heard them through a ringing in her ears that might have been shock, or might have been the sound of a house being described by someone who had never touched its walls. Garrett would keep Larkspur Lane. Dorothea would receive a limited settlement, enough to survive for a while, not enough to replace a life. Afterward, Judith touched her arm in the hallway. If we had clearer documentation of your grandmother's original contribution and your own financial and labor investment, this could have gone differently. Dorothea nodded. She was too tired to say that Lenora had tried to tell her this exact thing in a farmhouse near Staunton, with blue thread wrapped around every warning. Outside, the sky had not changed. The gray was the same gray it had been when she walked in, but the ground felt different beneath her shoes. Garrett waited near the courthouse steps. For a moment, Dorothea thought he might say something human, something cracked, something that admitted even briefly that the last 30 years had contained a woman whose hands were in every wall he now owned. Instead, he adjusted his cuff. I hope we can both move forward with dignity. Dorothea looked at him. She saw it now. Not cruelty. Cruelty required awareness. What Garrett had was something quieter and more complete. He had convinced himself that the story on the paperwork was the only story that had ever existed. And the woman standing in front of him was not someone he had wronged. She was someone who had simply failed to appear on the record. She walked past him without answering. That evening, Dorothea returned to Larkspur Lane for the last time. The court had given her 2 days to collect personal belongings. She packed what the settlement allowed. 2 suitcases, 1 cedar chest, a few photographs, her old sketchbooks full of room layouts and garden plans and fabric notes that no one had ever asked to see. In the kitchen, she opened the second drawer beside the stove. The drawer was empty. Not jumbled, not rearranged, empty, wiped clean. The note Lenora had written on blue paper 30 years ago for the house that already knows your name was gone. Dorothea stood in front of that open drawer for a long time. The light from the south-facing window crossed the counter the way it always had. The kitchen smelled the same. The floor creaked in the same places. But the note was gone, and the drawer had not emptied itself. Garrett had not started erasing her at the courthouse. He had started long before. And the only question now was how much he had already made disappear. Then the phone rang. Margot. Dorothea pressed the phone against her ear and heard her daughter's voice, careful and measured, using words that sounded rehearsed. Mom, I talked to Dad. He said the settlement was fair. He said you agreed to most of it. I just think maybe you should take some time and not make this harder than it needs to be. Dorothea leaned against the counter. The kitchen held her the way it always had, but the voice on the phone did not. Margot, do you know who chose the tile in the bathroom you grew up using? There was silence. Then Margot spoke again, softer now, confused. Mom, that is not what this is about. Do you know who rebuilt the garden wall? Who stripped the wallpaper in your bedroom? Who painted this porch every 2 years because the valley humidity would not leave it alone? Mom, Dad said. Your father said. Dorothea closed her eyes. What did you see? Margot did not answer. The silence was worse than the words, because the words were Garrett's, but the silence was Margot's own. Dorothea hung up. She placed the phone on the counter beside the empty drawer, and for the first time since the hearing, the grief split open into something sharper. Not the house. She could survive losing the house, but her daughter had looked at 30 years and seen only the name on the paperwork. That was the thing Garrett had taken that no settlement could measure. Not the walls, not the floors, not the garden or the porch or the light. He had taken the story, and now even Margot believed his version. Dorothea closed the drawer. She picked up her suitcases. She carried the cedar chest to the car. She did not look back at the kitchen. By sunset, she was driving east on Route 250 with everything she had been allowed to keep. 2 suitcases in the back seat, 1 cedar chest in the trunk, a shrinking bank account, a car with an overdue service light. And somewhere deep in the mountains above Burnsville, a cabin she had never seen with a loose floorboard she had been told never to fix, waiting in the trees like a held breath. Dorothea did not know yet what was hidden under that floor. She did not know that Lenora had spent years building something no courtroom had been asked to examine. She did not know that a blue folder tied with white string contained the one thing Garrett had never prepared for. All she knew was that the drawer was empty. The note was gone. Her daughter's voice had carried someone else's words, and the iron key in her coat pocket was the only thing left that still felt like it belonged to her. The road past Burnsville did not feel like escape. It felt like driving with a question in the passenger seat and no signal to call anyone who might know the answer. Dorothea kept both hands on the wheel as morning opened slowly over the Blue Ridge. Fog sat in the hollows between ridges thick and still, like the mountains were holding something in their lungs they were not ready to release. The iron key rested in the cup holder beside a gas station receipt and a cold coffee she had forgotten to drink. Every few miles she glanced at it, not because she thought it would vanish, but because some part of her still could not believe Lenora had left a door waiting in the world for the exact moment Dorothea would have nowhere else to go. Past Burnsville, the highway narrowed. Stores gave way to barns, barns gave way to fences. Fences gave way to trees thick enough to swallow sound. Dorothea followed the hand-drawn map carefully. Beyond Caney River, left where the pavement thins. Third gravel road after the old white church. The church appeared just after noon, small, weathered clapboard, a cemetery sloping behind it with headstones older than the road. She slowed as she passed. The gravel road dipped, curved, and climbed between walls of rhododendron and pine. Branches scraped the windows. The cell signal vanished. For the first time in weeks, there was no courthouse, no attorney's office, no Garrett, no daughter repeating someone else's words. Only the road, only the key, only the map trembling slightly on the seat. After nearly 3 miles, the trees opened. The cabin stood in a clearing no bigger than a church parking lot. Dorothea stopped the car and did not move. The engine ticked. A creek ran somewhere behind the structure, water over stones, a sound so steady. It felt like it had been running since before anyone thought to build here. The cabin was smaller than she expected. Cedar siding gone silver with weather. A tin roof darkened by decades of rain. A porch with one railing loose on the left side. 2 front windows clouded with dust. It did not look valuable. It looked hidden. Those were different things, and Dorothea was only now learning to tell them apart. She stepped out. The mountain air was 10 degrees cooler than the valley. Damp leaves softened the ground beneath her shoes. The place smelled of pine sap, wet moss, and old wood that had outlasted more winters than anyone had thanked it for. On the porch, the boards groaned under her weight, but they held. The lock was old iron, dark with age. The key resisted. She turned harder. Something inside the mechanism gave not all at once, but in stages, like a door that needed to be sure before it opened. Inside was one main room, a stone fireplace with a blackened throat, a narrow bed against the far wall, a rocking chair near the window, shelves lined with jars, candles, and folded cloth. And there, beneath the south-facing window, was Lenora's kitchen table. Plain wood, scarred surface, knife marks near one corner, a pale ring from an old cup, a burn mark shaped like a crescent moon. This was not a beautiful table. It was a used one, a kept one, a table that had held meals and letters and decisions and grief, and had never once pretended to be anything other than what it was. Dorothea sat down. The chair was hard and cold. The cabin smelled of cedar and something faintly sweet, maybe lavender. Maybe the ghost of a woman who had tucked it into every drawer she ever owned. For a long time, Dorothea thought this was why Lenora had sent her here. A place to breathe. A place Garrett could not reach. A place where the walls had never heard his voice. Then her eyes moved beneath the table. The floorboards ran unevenly across the room. Most were tight. One was not. Third board from the left. The words arrived exactly as Lenora had spoken them. Dorothea lowered herself to the floor. Her knees pressed into dust. Her fingers found the edge of the board. It lifted too easily, as if it had been waiting for this hand and no other. Beneath it was a shallow space lined with old newspaper, and inside that space, wrapped in oilcloth, was a locked tin box. The lid opened with the sound she felt behind her ribs. A small click, a small release, then stillness. Inside was a blue folder, faded at the corners, tied with white string. Across the front, in handwriting that had not changed in 60 years, were 7 words: "For the house they may try to take." Dorothea untied the string. The first page was a letter. "My Dorothea, if you are reading this, someone has made you feel that the life you built can be taken because your name was not placed where it should have been. I could not make you see Garrett before you were ready. A woman has to wake up in her own time. But I could keep records. I could keep proof. I could keep something safe for the day memory would not be enough." Dorothea placed one palm flat on the table. She needed something solid. Behind the letter was a copy of the cashier's check. The memo line was clear: "Gift to Dorothea Calloway for purchase of residence. Separate family contribution." Behind that were transfer records, copies of deposit slips, a receipt from the closing attorney. Then a notarized statement dated 27 years earlier. Lenora's signature at the bottom, a witness signature beside it. "The funds provided to my granddaughter Dorothea Calloway are a personal family gift intended solely for her contribution toward the purchase and protection of the property known as Larkspur Lane." Then came receipts: tile, lumber, paint, porch railings, garden drainage. Several were in Dorothea's name. Others carried Lenora's handwriting in the margins. "Paid from Dorothea's personal account. Kitchen restoration. Front porch repair. Material selected and purchased by Dorothea." Then the photographs. Dorothea in old jeans beside a stack of floorboards. Dorothea in the unfinished kitchen hair, tied back paint on her wrist cabinets bare behind her. Dorothea kneeling in the garden mud on her knees, hands deep in the soil. And in one photograph, standing just behind her, barely in frame, Lenora. Smiling the way a woman smiles when she already knows that history will need a witness, and she has decided to be one. On the back of that photograph in blue ink, "This is the day she began making the house live again." Dorothea pressed the photo flat against the table, and the grief she had carried so carefully since the courthouse packed tight, held in place, managed with the discipline of a woman who had spent 30 years making uncomfortable things look presentable, finally came apart. She cried because Lenora had believed her before there was a case. She cried because the house had not imagined her labor. She cried because someone had understood that a woman's work could be stolen twice. First by the man who took credit, then by the record he controlled. At the bottom of the folder was one final page. A list. 20 names, phone numbers, addresses, old contractors, a retired closing assistant, a neighbor from Larkspur Lane, a former bookkeeper from Garrett's office. At the top, Lenora had written, "People who saw what you did." Dorothea wiped her face with her sleeve. That list changed the room. The check proved money. The receipts proved labor. The notarized statement proved intent. But the names meant she would not have to stand alone. She reached for her phone. No signal. The screen showed nothing. She almost laughed through what was left of the crying. Of course there was no signal. Not here. Not yet. The truth would have to wait for a tower. She placed every page back in the folder carefully, the way you handle something that is both fragile and indestructible, and held it against her chest. By morning she would leave the mountain long enough to find 2 bars at the church parking lot. She would call Judith Pemberton. She would read every document aloud slowly, and hear Judith's silence change from listening to calculating. She would hear Judith say, "This does not hand you the house back today, but it changes the conversation." And Dorothea would close her eyes and understand that a changed conversation was more than she had yesterday. She would call the first name on the list. Harlan Boggs, retired carpenter near Lexington. He would not place her at first. Then she would mention Larkspur Lane, the porch railing, the kitchen window trim, and Harlan would go quiet and say, You are the wife who knew the measurements. Your husband talked more, but you were the one who knew the house. She would ask if he had records. He would say maybe. Then he would pause and add, "But I remember this. He asked me to put the final invoice under his name. Said it kept things clean. Clean. The same word. Always the same word." Dorothea would write it in her notebook and underline it once. But before any of that, before the phone calls and the copies and the demand letter, Judith would draft with questions Garrett had never expected to see on paper. Something else happened. Something the folder could not have predicted. Dorothea's phone buzzed the moment she reached signal at the church lot. Not Judith, not Harlan, Garrett. She stared at the screen. Allison had not contacted his attorney yet. No one connected to the case knew about the cabin. The phone rang 3 times, then stopped. A voicemail appeared. Dorothea played it with the windows down and the mountain air moving through the car. Garrett's voice was measured, controlled. The same voice he used for closings and client dinners, and every negotiation he had ever won by staying calm while someone else became emotional. "Dorothea, I have heard you have been calling people about Larkspur Lane. I do not know what you think you are doing, but the settlement is final. I would hate to see you waste what little money you have chasing false hope." Then the softness came, the familiar softness, the one that always arrived just before a door closed. "I am saying this because I care. Be careful." She saved the message. She called Judith. She played it twice over the phone. Judith listened without interrupting. "Save it. You think it matters. I think men who feel safe do not leave warnings this early." That night back at the cabin, headlights moved across the wall. Dorothea froze. One vehicle was climbing the gravel road slowly, too slowly to be lost. The headlights stopped at the edge of the clearing. A black SUV, Garrett's SUV. She rose without turning on a light. Through the window, she watched him step out and look around the clearing. Not worried, not sorry, measuring. The way he used to stand in front of properties he planned to acquire. He looked at the cabin the way he looked at everything, as a thing to be calculated. He did not knock. He stood there for 2 full minutes. Then he got back in the SUV and drove away. Dorothea did not sleep after that. But she was not frightened. Garrett had come to measure a threat, which meant the threat was real, which meant Lenora had been right about everything. The demand letter went out 3 days later. It named the cashier's check, the notarized statement, the bank records, the invoices, the witnesses, the voicemail, and it asked the questions Garrett had never expected to see in writing. Why was the separate family gift not disclosed during proceedings? Why were Dorothea's renovation expenses buried under his name? Why did he contact her after learning she was gathering records? Why did he appear at a private property never listed in the divorce? For 2 weeks, silence. Then Garrett's attorney requested a private settlement meeting. The meeting took place in a conference room in Staunton. Glass walls, gray carpet, a table polished so brightly it reflected everyone's hands. Garrett arrived in a navy suit, same posture, same controlled face. But his confidence no longer filled the room before he did. Patricia Voss spoke first. She called the situation unfortunate. She called the documents unexpected. She said no one wanted to reopen painful history. Judith opened the blue folder. The first offer was low. Judith declined. The second was better. Still not enough. Then Judith placed one photograph on the table. Dorothea in the unfinished kitchen. Paint on her wrist. Cabinets bare. Light coming through the windows she had refused to replace because the old glass had a warmth that new glass would never learn. On the back in blue ink, "This is the day she began making the house live again." Garrett looked at the photograph. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. For once no ready sentence arrived. Then a phone buzzed. Dorothea looked down. A text from Margot. "Mom, I found a box of old photos in the attic. There is one of you standing in the kitchen before the cabinets were done. You look so young. You are covered in paint. I never knew you did all that. Then a second message. I am sorry, I did not see it. Dorothea placed the phone face down on the table. Her hand did not shake. But something behind her eyes shifted, and Judith saw it, and even Patricia Voss saw it, though she looked away. Dorothea spoke then, quietly, not to the attorneys, to Garrett. I am not here because I want the old house back. I love that house. I built much of what made it valuable. You know that. I know that. And now the record is going to know it too. You spent years letting me disappear from my own work. I am not asking you to become honest because it is noble. I am asking because the proof no longer gives you another choice. The final settlement came 1 week later. It did not give Dorothea every year back. No document could. But it placed one sentence into the legal record that Garrett could not soften or revise. Dorothea Calloway made substantial documented contributions to the acquisition restoration and increased value of the Larkspur Lane property. She read that sentence 3 times, not because it healed everything, because it existed, her name, her work, on the record. People expected her to want Larkspur Lane back. Judith asked carefully. Margot asked gently. Even Harlan Boggs, when she called to thank him, said she had earned the right to walk through that front door again. Dorothea thought about it. One afternoon, she drove past the house. The oak was in full leaf. The porch looked freshly painted by someone who had not matched the original shade. The new brass lock caught the sun. She kept driving. She did not want to win her way back into a room that had taught her how to vanish. The cabin needed work, real work. The roof needed patching. The porch needed leveling. The kitchen window stuck halfway. Dorothea used the settlement carefully, not to make the cabin grand, to make it hers. She sanded Lenora's kitchen table and sealed it, but left every scar visible. She framed the letter beside the south-facing window where the light came through each morning without being asked. She built a studio along the back wall, a long work table under the window, shelves for fabric and paint and old tools, a wall where she pinned plans for restoration projects around the county. People began calling, a neighbor first, then a shop owner in Burnsville, then a couple restoring a farmhouse near Spruce Pine. They did not call Garrett. They called Dorothea. Margot drove up on a Saturday in October. She stood on the porch and looked at the clearing and the creek and the mountains behind the trees and did not say anything for a long time. Then she walked inside and saw the table. She ran her fingers over the scars in the wood, the knife marks, the cup ring, the crescent burn. You kept all of it? Dorothea set 2 cups of coffee on the surface. Every mark is a year somebody sat here and lived. Margot wrapped both hands around her cup. The steam rose between them. One morning, almost a year after she left Larkspur Lane, Dorothea stood in the cabin with coffee in her hand. Sunlight crossed the floor where she had once knelt and found the box. Fresh curtains moved softly at the window. Firewood sat stacked beside the door. Lenora's photograph rested on the shelf, slightly faded, still smiling the way a woman smiles when she has already done everything she can and the rest is up to the living. Nothing about the cabin looked rich, but everything in it had a name, and the name was hers. Outside, the oak leaves along the creek had begun to turn. The mountains held the first cold of autumn in their shoulders. The tin roof ticked as the morning sun warmed the metal, and the kitchen table sat beneath the window the way it had sat for decades, carrying the weight of whatever was placed upon it, asking nothing, holding everything. Dorothea did not return to the house that forgot her. She built her life in the place that remembered her first. If Dorothea's story stayed with you, leave a like so more people can find it. And if you believe that years of labor and love and sacrifice should not be erased by the person who held the pen, subscribe to this channel, because these are the stories that do not get told often enough. Now tell me in the comments, what part of Dorothea's journey hit you the hardest? Lenora's hidden proof, Garrett facing the record he built, Margot finally seeing her mother, or Dorothea choosing a scarred table over the house she lost?